Good afternoon, everyone. Almost good evening. With our delays, we are indeed almost in the evening. So, I would like to welcome all of you to our second panel of this conference, Time, Space, Nation, the Discourses of the War in Ukraine, in an attempt to somehow close the temporal gap we've opened, so we'll try to be brief and to the point. We'll hear all three presentations in a row, and then we'll leave a bit of time for questions. So our first speaker today is Dr. Vera Kaplan, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of History here at Tel Aviv University. Her research interests lie in the areas of cultural and social history and the history of education in Russia, focusing especially on history as a profession, history of the Russian Revolution of 1917 and post-revolutionary immigration, and on the history of teaching in post-Soviet Russia. She co-edited together with Ben Akloff and Larry Holmes the book Educational Reforms in Post-Soviet Russia, Legacies and Prospects, which was published by Routledge in 2005, and the second edition of this actually was published again in 2014. Her own research and manuscript discuss historical societies in late 19th century. She also led the Cummings Center for a long time, and now the head of the Cummings Center switched to Professor Iris Rachamimov of the History Department, but Vera was the person involved at the beginning of the war here with us, so we look forward to hearing her presentation, Temporality, Spatiality, and Politics in Post-Soviet Discourse. Please, Vera.
Thank you very much for organizers of this conference. It is very inspiring, and I am especially grateful to Dr. Anastasia Zinevich for her presentation, because it's a rare opportunity to talk about perception of time. And this is very important for me, because now I'm actually will make a switch from resilience of Ukrainian population to the submissiveness of the Russian population. Because among the tragic questions which have been brought up by Russia's war against Ukraine, one of the most puzzling one is the apparent receptiveness of the official military propaganda by the significant part of the Russian society. In order to explain it, we should look not only at the political, but also at the cultural processes which Russian society underwent in the post-Soviet and post-socialist period, and try to examine the changes which took place in the most basic concepts of culture, including perception of time and space. And I think the importance of cultural aspect of the topic was clear from all the previous presentation, even it was talk about economy or commerce or something like this. In this paper, I have attempted to analyze these changes through examining the late Soviet and post-Soviet educational discourse, especially with regard to history teaching, which is a particularly sensitive seismograph of the social and cultural changes in any society, Russian included. Soviet educational discourse was essentially temporal. Soviet social studies were based on the Marxist theory of historical materialism, which delineated human history as a progressive movement towards the communist socio-economic formation through a chain of law of formation, which were regarded as natural stages of historical development. The teleological nature of this perspective emphasized the temporal dimension of history and historical development was depicted as a linear, invariant, and irreversible process. As the well-known Russian medievalist Aaron Gurevich explained, the route of history resembles a railroad. A train can pass by a station despite the timetable, but it still moves along the same track. The temporality of this concept was especially manifest in the notion of socialism. Being perceived as a phase in the transition from capitalism to communism, socialism was open to and oriented towards the future. From this perspective, the Soviet conception of socialism was consistent with other modern concepts of movement, such as republicanism or liberalism, whose common denominator was the strong element of promise. In the promise, anticipation, and expectation. According to Kozelek's well-known formula, they were oriented to the horizon of expectation, not to the sphere of experience. In this way, a distinct Soviet socialist utopia was created, where the better and, to cite Foucault, fundamentally unreal space was located elsewhere in the future and projected its utopian ideal onto the present. Kozelek, however, also addressed a situation in which the temporal structure of the concept of modernity could change if their political design would be realized. When he wrote about it, no one foresaw that it would be the end of socialism, rather than the arrival of communism would one day be announced. But it did happen in the late Soviet Russia. The process started from the formation explanatory model lost its effectiveness as a result of the changes in the status of Marxist ideology in the late Soviet Union. Alexei Yurchak has explained this process in his well-known book entitled Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. It became less, I'm quoting, it became less important to read ideological representations for literal meaning than to reproduce their precise structural forms. This transformation of a discursive regime eventually led to a profound shift within Soviet culture, opening up spaces of indeterminacy, creativity, and unanticipated meanings in the context of strict formulaic ideological forms, rituals, and organizations. In the case of schools, these changes allowed for a certain degree of teachers' agency that enabled them to invent a variety of tactics for manipulating the seemingly unbending state-controlled school curriculum. The enrichment of history classes with additional materials helped to develop a receptive attitude to different representation of the past and present found in literature, including underground literature, samizdat, cinema, or transmitted by older members of the pupils' family. At the same time, commitment to their pupils required teachers to make them familiar with the official narratives prescribed by the school curriculum. The results were striking. As James Verge discovered in his study on the perception of the past among ethnic Estonians in Estonia in the last years of the Soviet Union, all the interviewees actually knew two accounts of the events, the official version and an unofficial one. Verge concluded that this situation was typical of the late Soviet Union as a whole. And I'm quoting again, in Estonia, as well as in Russia and other parts of the Soviet Union, in 1970s and 1980s, were characterized by growing cynicism about official history and increasingly active production of unofficial histories through the underground press, jokes, drama, and other avenues. One upshot of all this was a growing salience of unofficial accounts of the past and intensified opposition between official and unofficial histories. This growing controversy was one of the elements that signified the crisis of socialism as a social system and as a concept promising a radiant future. In the late 80s, in the wake of the perestroika political reforms, public discussion already included talks about the necessity of finding ways out of socialism, and with socialism transfer from the horizon of expectations to the space of experience. Its abrupt transformation from a dynamic concept of movement into the static phenomenon of the past, Russian educators, historians, and social scientists found themselves facing a unique situation. In order to liberate themselves from a failed socialism, it became necessary to search for other avenues of development that might not have been successfully realized in the past, but could be achieved in the present. In this way, the future-oriented utopia of the late socialism was gradually replaced by the post-socialist heterotopia, which was characterized by inventing parallel spaces embedded in the past, each of which contained the possibility of developing its own version of the present. On the theoretical level, this process began with the replacement of the concept of socio-economic formation by the long-existing concept of civilization. The civilization-oriented approach to the past made it possible to formulate the idea of civilizational alternatives, and those who lived in the late Soviet Union know how much joy was in this concept of it was another possibility, we can do it now. And formulate the idea of civilization alternative and variants of historical development. As a result, history was no longer linear and invariant. At this stage, the concept of civilization assumed an opportunity for choice in history. Not surprisingly, in the late 80s and early 90s, it was seen as very much as in line with democratic reforms of the society in general and history education in particularly. Gradually, however, the situation started to change when the country reforms in education were launched in the early 2000s as part of the increasingly conservative trend in politics. The notions of alternative and choice disappeared from the textbooks to be replaced by the idea of the stability and invariability of the basic components of a culture. National character is a national character. It was so thousands of years ago, it will continue to be so. A milestone in this process was the publication in 2007 of a new handbook for history teachers entitled The Modern History of Russia and devoted to the politically charged period of 1945-2006. The text marked a significant departure from the first generation of post-Soviet textbooks. Contrary to the textbooks of the 1990s, which attempt to dissociate post-Soviet Russia from the Soviet Union, the new handbook emphasized the deep connections between the imperial, Soviet, and post-Soviet periods of Russian history, defining the Soviet state as an embodiment of traditional Russian statehood. This statehood, it claimed, was characterized by a particular attitude to authority and norms of government, manifested in the centralization of power and, not surprisingly, the omnipotent status of the head of state. By highlighting the stable structures of Russian historical existence, its authors explicitly argued that the real goal of Soviet domestic and foreign policy, especially in Stalin's time, had been to restore the Russian Empire. According to the same logic, the world system or alliance of socialist states was depicted as a sphere of Soviet geopolitical interests, which strengthened the image of the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics as euphemism for the Russian Empire. As handbook put it, the state whose territory was brought together over the centuries by many generations of Russians. The handbook was recreated a utopian space, now what of the lost Soviet Union, re-envisaged as the Russian Empire, while avoiding any attempt to examine the Commonwealth of Independent States as a geopolitical entity. This utopian space was depicted mainly in the source materials, which appeared under the rubric Documents of the Epoch, and in particular in the article Russian Asia, Русская Азия, by journalist Vitaly Tretyakov, originally published in Moscow News in 2006, and it's completely available online. The article argued that a new Russia-centered coalition should be created on the canonical space of Russia's historical presence and influence, and characterized Russia's current borders as unnatural, or at least perceived as such by the majority of the political class, because they did not guarantee a sufficient level of security. This article thus introduced two notions of space: the canonical space of historical presence and territory defined by state borders. At first glance, they seemed contradictory. The term canonical space was ambiguous. While signifying something that might be taken as a rule or generally accepted, it could also mean any status that is defined conventionally or traditionally rather than juridically, but it could also denote church power on a certain territory. The notion of territory defined by the state borders was much more clear-cut, but it was obfuscated by the doubts expressed to their natural character. However, taken together, they depicted post-Soviet space as fluid and unstable from the geopolitical point of view, but uncontested and deep-rooted from the cultural and historical perspective. Also, this handbook was severely criticized by historians and educators. In the following year, the same authors produced a textbook that was approved by the Ministry of Education for usage in schools. The publication of such a politically loaded textbook, apparently supported by the highest echelons of power, was generally perceived as an attempt to establish new ideological markers. President Putin's suggestion some years later, in 2013, to replace the existing textbook in Russian history with a new book that would present what he termed the canonical version of national history, was seen as even clearer indication of this tendency, which became much stronger in the following years. Moreover, the changes in the perception of space led to a corresponding modification of the perception of time. The constant discovery of past structures in the political and cultural patterns of the present blurred the contours of the future and made time itself cyclical and repetitive. These changes have not been limited to the realm of theory, and their practical impact can be seen beyond the school walls, most strikingly in the commemorative practices of the last decade, and especially in the new mode of celebrating Victory Day, which is going to be very close on the 9th of May. As Vera Michlin-Shapir has noted in her recent book, Fluid Russia, Between the Global and the National in the Post-Soviet Era, this holiday became increasingly popular during the post-Soviet decade. From the 1990s, the main role in the Victory Day celebration was played by veterans who marched in the military parade alongside soldiers in active service. In 2005, on the 60th anniversary of this event, the aging veterans who could still participate in the parade was driven on military tracks decorated to look as though they dated from the Second World War. This was not the only reenactment. The parade was opened by military units dressed in uniforms from the time of the war. These elements of performing the past in the Victory Day celebration gained a new meaning. Then 2 years later, in 2007, a new idea appeared far from Moscow in the western Siberian city of Tyumen to hold a procession in which participants would carry photos of deceased veterans and fallen relatives. in the following years, several cities across Russia held similar procession. Eventually, they were named the Immortal Regiment, Бессмертный полк. In 2015, about 500,000 participants marched in the procession in Moscow, among them President Putin, who carried a photo of his father. This kind of celebration continued until now, but were cancelled for this year. It would be no such procession on the 9th of May next week. And almost all the participants wore the black and orange striped Georgian ribbon, which has been part of the St. George military decoration in the Russian Empire, but actually had no connection with the Second World War. In addition, some participants wore elements from the soldiers' uniform of that period. This performance not only strengthened the memory of the Second World War, but actually reinvented the victory as a contemporary event. This intervening of the past with the present made it possible to revive not only the heroes of the war, but also its villains, as shown by the persistent efforts of the official Russian propaganda to portray Russia as continuing its historical fight against the Nazis now in Ukraine. The effectiveness of this propaganda and the distinctive perception of temporality characteristic of contemporary Russian society was demonstrated by the reaction of the Russian population to this new war. At the same time, the war accentuated the heterotopian notion of another Russia that could signify completely different phenomena. On the one hand, the part of Russian society that seeks to distance itself from the government's aggressive policy, or on the other hand, the anti-Russia depicted by the official propaganda, as demonstrated Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov some days ago. And this propaganda seeks to present Ukraine as an instrument of the West battle against Russia. How long this play with time and space could be possible? As history teaches us, it's not endless. But actually, history is not a teacher. As famous Russian historian Kluchevsky said almost 100 years ago, history is not a teacher, but a warden. She does not teach, but punishes. And actually, there's nothing to add to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vera. I think by now we all understand, as Professor Bruya Adini began and Anastasia Zinevich continued, that what is important is not only the hopes and perceptions and our expectations and our desires, but our perceptions of reality, how we approach the present, how we approach the past, what are the terms that we think about when we think about history, and discourse is part of it, and we design the past according to the present, and then this goes vice versa, and our past designs our present. So, continuing this exploration, we'll hear the presentation of Dr. Dmitry Skulski, who is an Israeli sociologist of Russian origin. He holds a PhD in sociology and anthropology from Tel Aviv University, and he has undertaken ethnographic work in two Siberian cities as he studied the ways of perception and representation of Stalinism in post-socialist Russia. Using qualitative methodology, Skulski showed how the unsettled dispute over the historical role and the moral profile of Stalinist past constitutes a source of existential anxiety in the everyday life of many Russians. So his current project explores how ideology of care and glorification of national history shapes current violent lines of Russia's foreign policy, and we'll now hear his presentation, The History of Aggression, Discursive Reasons for Russia's Attack on Ukraine. Please.
Much appreciated. Yeah, well,
Or no?
Where is my, yeah, just a second. Well, thank you, Dina, and I regard this talk as a, so it is sort of inspired by the question that I guess uses many of us from time to time, a very basic one, which is, why the hell they attacked? Yes, so I'm trying to offer a sort of contemplation about it. Well, recent years have seen Russian foreign policy become simultaneously more aggressive and history-centric. In 2014, this official political rhetoric referred to historical reasons as justification for the annexation of Crimea and the active support afforded to the rebels in Donbass. And in 2022, this very history-oriented rhetoric was implemented with regard to the full-scale aggression against Ukraine. How do I actually... Yeah, and if I want to know... Okay, I will do it just manually, maybe.
Switch to presentation.
Excuse me? Ah, yes, right. Okay. So, for example, when 3 days before the war, Putin justified the recognition of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk national republics as independent states, he pointed to several reasons for that dramatic move, ranging from the alleged potential of the nuclear threat from Ukraine to Kiev's strategic course on joining NATO, to the, quote, far-right nationalism, which rapidly developed into aggressive Russophobia and neo-Nazism, end quote. These reasons, however, were mentioned only following a 15-minute long historical passage on how, quote, the people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russian and Orthodox Christians, end quote, and how modern Ukraine was created as a result of severing what is historically Russian land. Now, the speech on the occasion of the beginning of the special military operation also contained references to Russian history. And this was the case with almost all of Putin's key speeches, including the one delivered on the occasion of the inclusion of DNR and LNR, Kherson Oblast and Zaporizhia into the Russian Federation. And on that day, and this is interesting, Putin reminded his audience that he, Novorossiya, Rumyantsev, Suvorov, and Ushakov fought their battles, and Catherine the Great and Potemkin founded new cities. And one can hardly find any causal or legal connection between the military exploits of General Rumyantsev and Admiral Ushakov in the 18th century and the annexation of Ukrainian territories in the beginning of the 21st one. Right? This connection, however, is plain on the level of history as narration. On this level, the fact that Ushakov and Rumyantsev, as Russian historical figures, lived in southeast Ukraine, integrated these southeastern lands into Russian history. So Russian generals, in other words, ensured that Ukraine is a Russian story, Russian history. And in the post-Soviet period, in this logic, following the independence of Ukraine, the histories of Zaporizhia, Luhansk, and Donetsk were separated from the Russian history, and as a result, this history was robbed of important content. This content diminution, in turn, also marks the beginning of the storyline of decline. So it is, in this logic, it is now the patriotic obligation of Putin and Russian citizens to correct that double wrong by bringing the missing content back and replacing the storyline of decline with that of gathering, right? So in this respect, the annexation and the attack on Ukraine was the implementation of policy of care for the Russian historical narrative. Now, it's sort of like politics is made for the sake of history, right? So this historiocentric line of political reasoning is not limited to Putin's speeches. The war-related concern with history has been repeatedly expressed by other key actors of Putin's regime, like Medvedev or Patrushev or Simonyan, you name it. Commissions for fighting the falsification of history are established on the presidential level. Criminal prosecution is exercised against the falsifiers. And even the recent constitutional amendment charges the state with the protection of historical truth. So one might ask, what makes care for history an obligation capable of shaping political action, including the most gruesome, the most devastating, and the most unforgivable one, like war on Ukraine? Now, authors who refer to the issue of history in politics tend to regard it as a manipulation tool. Right? I submit, however, that subjects are not I following Michel Foucault, for example, submit that subjects are products rather than masters of the discourse that they reproduce. And indeed, evidence suggests that Russian elites tend to act, speak, and think within the established discursive order rather than manipulated it from the author position. And even if one suggests that political discourse in Russia is manipulated by Putin's authorities, its messages still have to resonate with the public opinion in order to be effective. So, to avoid the artificial downplaying of the role of history in Russian society, I propose employing a consciously naive approach by suggesting that Russian aggression against Ukraine was indeed made for the sake of history. And uses this suggestion as a point of departure as I examine speeches of Putin and other top players, also media references, legislation initiatives, and all with the goal to acquire an understanding of the discursive setting that makes history a major political factor. And at this point, I would like to note that this political care for the glory of Russian history is unfolding against the background of the dominance of patriotism in the Russian political sphere. The post-Soviet iteration of Russian patriotism emerged out of the shared feeling of loss following the disintegration of the USSR. We're talking about Ushakin here. Towards the late 1990s, the grassroots, this patriotism was adopted by the authorities, so patriotic clubs were opened, patriotic youth movements were established, the patriotic canon of school history, right? Education was developed, as in fact Vera explicated. Television, the church, the movie industry, and the military all contributed to the rise of patriotism to the position of dominance over the public sphere. And as Putin mentioned in 2016, we have no and there can be no other unifying idea except patriotism. So as of today, almost everything, let me show you this nice metaphor, the cosmic one. As of today, almost everything is at sphere orbit around the notion of the motherland and Russia. And just as the position and movements of planets are determined mainly by their gravitation towards the sun, so actors and actions, politicians and policies are evaluated according to the impact on the good of the motherland. Like if you, let's say, sacrifice for the sake of the motherland in the Second World War, then you are a hero. If you If you're not, then you might be a traitor, etc. A very simple a very simple model. However, with a catch. Ironically, the more motherland-oriented the Russian public sphere becomes, the less sensible the term motherland gets. I mean, if the public sphere is about the motherland, then the term motherland can only refer to itself, that is to be of tautological character. The patriotism, therefore, revolves around the empty place. The sun turns into a black hole, draining the meaning out of the patriotic discursive order, making it unstable and potentially unusable. Being a patriot in these circumstances becomes a challenging task. It is hard to contribute to the motherland when it is unclear what the motherland is and what she needs. And indeed, research shows that for many Russians, the motherland appears as distant, increasingly distant, and difficult to grasp. And I suggest that it is against this background that national history comes into play. The Russian history, as its name suggests, directly corresponds with Russia's being. It constitutes a direct narration of that being, so that whatever Russia is, it can be expressed in historical terms, right? And history is a simple thing, it is a text. So unlike the elusive character of Russia, the historical narrative is readily available. It is indeed systematically accessed through textbooks, movies, TV shows, school education, and increasingly in Russia, speeches of politicians. Correspondingly, the patriotic discourse in its history-mediated version can sustain its integrity. Everything within its frame, from ideas to policies to human subjects, may be evaluated according to their contribution to the greatness of Russian history. And even more importantly, on the individual level, history acts as a medium through which one's patriotic sentiment can find practical implementation. Whilst history expresses the being of the motherland, it likewise corresponds to the being of human subjects. A mere fact of living in historical time guarantees one's embeddedness in history. So by participating in historical events or by just living in historical times, subjects partake in the making of national history. So due to the mediation of history, one's patriotism can find a practical implementation. Being a patriot means living for history's sake, that is, living so that the greatness of the Russian historical corpus could be sustained and multiplied. Now, I would like to mention three consequences of that sentence. That I would like, but in fact I will mention only two because I'm running out of time. Okay. The first one has to do with the subjugation of politics to history. Since in the frame of the historical patriotism, citizens and politicians alike are evaluated according to their contribution to the greatness of Russian history, bringing Russians to historical achievements constitutes a major political task. It is in the sphere of politics where the subjects are disciplined, educated, and sacrificed so that a great history could be composed. And in this order of discourse, history is not only a record but also a goal of political action. Relative to history, politics is merely of instrumental meaning. The next one would be relevant to what Vera just have said, but I have to skip it, unfortunately. And finally, and most importantly, to the purpose of this talk, one should mention the historicization of the future. History is always in the making. New histories are being added to the historical narrative as it unfolds with time. The future in this respect is a history in becoming. So in the current version of Russian patriotism, ensuring the greatness of this becoming history constitutes one's major patriotic duty. This means, in turn, that the potential historical significance of a future event makes it a legitimate goal of political action or policy. And it is this effect of historicization of the future that is in play, as I suggest, with the Russian aggression against Ukraine. In 2014, the potential historical importance of the unification with Crimea ensured that the actual annexation of the peninsula was widely supported. And a year ago, in 2022, the alleged historical significance of denazification and gathering the historical lens provided one of the maybe main reasons for the Russian aggression. Today's version of Russian patriotism is characterized by the subjugation of reality to its representation, of politics to political history. The attack against Ukraine, the suffering and destruction that it inflicted was commenced to a considerable degree for the sake of the story. Considering the prominence of historical patriotism in today's Russian public sphere, chances are great, unfortunately, that Russia will continue implementing their aggressive course of policy. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, sure.
We'll do questions at the end.
Okay.
Okay. I promise you we'll leave some time because our speakers are so disciplined in this panel, so we'll have time for questions. Actually, thank you very much, Dmitry. Actually, this reminded me of the Soviet joke that the Soviet Union is a country of an unpredicted past. So I guess this continues to Russia as well. And we will now hear Dr. Leonid Gershovitz, who will take us to another aspect of discourse, of thinking, of perceptions, one that we haven't dealt with yet in this conference. And this is the idea of how ideas of anti-Semitism, Jews connect to this story. This question is inevitable, not only because we live in Israel and the relations between Israel and Ukraine and Russia came up so many times during the last year, but also because Zelensky is Jewish, and this came up, no doubt, for people in Ukraine and in Russia. So Dr. Leonid Gershovitz is an educator and independent researcher specializing in the history of Soviet Jewry. He has a PhD degree from Tel Aviv University, and recently his research regarding anti-Semitism and Jewish themes in the propaganda and public discourse in Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine during the war was published in a paper in the collection of the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And the title of his talk is Anti-Semitism and Jewish Themes in the Propaganda and Public Discourse in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus during the Russian-Ukrainian war. Please.
So good evening, everybody. Thank you for staying till now. For the organizers, thank you very much for having me. I will talk about the Jewish aspect of this war, which is not central for the war, but it definitely exists during the war. It definitely exists as part of the war and as part of the propaganda and discourse about the war. It is based on the paper I wrote, as Dina actually said. Because we are short in time, I will definitely will not be able to touch all the details and to talk about all the different details. So I encourage you to read the paper itself. It is available online and free access, and you will definitely learn more and will have some interesting insights about it. So, as you all know, 24th of February 2022, there was a Russian invasion to Ukraine, and we had this famous speech of Mr. Putin, President of the Russian Federation. Kind of very early in the morning, he gave a speech, and he was talking about the aims of this war, what is the purpose, and he was also talking about a goal of Nazification, or denazification of Ukraine, denazification, demilitarization, and all the other things that he actually said. But talking about denazification, he actually took all the discourse about the war in the sphere of talking about World War II which is inventable, also talking about the Holocaust and about the Jewish theme. So, what I wanted to check is to see how much the Jewish issue, both anti-Semitic talks or the anti-Semitic affairs appear really in Russian, mainly in Russian, also Belarusian propaganda, and also how the Jewish issue is being used in Russian propaganda on official level and also non-official level. So what did I do is I went basically to check in the official media and the social media, such as YouTube, such as Facebook, which is not used anymore too much by the Russians, and also very much in Telegram channels, which are highly populated among the Russian-speaking speakers in Eastern Europe. And I tried to search for these things, basically, that you can see on the screen, such as direct expressions of anti-Semitism, allusions to the Jewish origins of the personalities involved in the conflicts, highlighting of Israel's stance for this or other party in the conflict, reference to Jewish symbols, negative stereotypes related to or attributed to the Jews, and instrumental approach to Holocaust and such kind of things. A little bit of history, because Russia has a preposition for anti-Semitism. It has a very, very long history regarding anti-Semitism, as you can see here, like the protocols of the Sages of Zion, Bailey's affair, and also electoral propaganda of the Union of Russian people who are highly anti-Semitic. If you can see there is a slogan, "We don't give equality to the Jews." It continued on during the Soviet period. As you can see, different kind of manifestations. Rather, instead of Jews, it were Zionists who are to blame for all the world's problems, basically. I will not go deeply into this issue because we are short of time. And then we have the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, August 91, and Russian attitude towards, now it's independent Russian attitude towards Jewish issue and anti-Semitism takes in two, we can say even contradicting directions. On one hand, really anti-Semitic attitudes are on margin. On other hand, during the last years, the margin itself, not only in issues of Jews and anti-Semitism, starting to move towards the center of the Russian discourse. Once again, I'm not concentrating only on the Jewish issue, but generally the marginal approaches toward what is Russian state, what is the official ideology of Russian state. As you can see here, you can see the Dugin, who really wasn't the margins, but now his ideas are becoming more and more acceptable among the, let's call it, center of the Russian society. And he talks about really kind of fascist, or really or almost fascist society. So we have this kind of contradicting attitudes, where maybe not so contradicting, actually. Belarus. Well, why Belarus? Belarus is a country to the west, geographically, of Russian Federation, and they're kind of united in one unified state, but not really unified state. But what is much more important for us, that in Belarus, Russian troops are placed in Belarus, and Russia uses Belarus as a platform to attack Ukraine, or it used it initially in the beginning of the war. The northern direction of the attack of Russia was from the north, from Belarusian territory, towards the areas of Chernobyl, and there downstairs to the south, to Kiev area. And Belarus is a quite unique country, which is more likely to remind us what was Soviet Union. And actually proud of this very much. And after basically 4 years of kind of more democratic, more liberal attitude, Mr. Lukashenko, which you can see over there from the left, came to the power in presidential elections, 1994. And this guy has a quite long history of different sayings which can be heard or can be interpreted as clearly anti-Semitic, as just one you can see there. It was pretty long time ago, but while visiting the town, or the city actually, of Babruisk, who really was, used to be a Jewish town, such important figures in Jewish and Zionist history as Ber Katzanerson, as Abba Achimeir, as Yitzhak Tabenkin were born there. He was saying about this city. In the past, it was scary to enter there. It was a piggery. It was a predominantly Jewish city. You know how Jews treat the place where they live in. So basically, he said this town is dirty, and because Jews live there. So he's this kind of attitude. And he has more sayings. Once again, if you had more time, I'll show you, I would like to show you this short video over there, which has basically the same idea. And of course, we have the issue of Ukraine, which also went to transformation from really anti-Semitic attitude of parts of the population, of Ukrainian population, to much more tolerant, more loyal approach towards the Jews, even though anti-Semitism didn't disappear in Ukraine. It still exists on people's level. But the officials of Ukraine, the government of Ukraine, try to distance themselves from anti-Semitism as much as they can. One of the reasons for this is because they want to be closer to the West, and the West really don't want to hear this kind of anti-Semitic issues and attitudes, but we still can see, for example, this popular anti-Semitism vandalizing, like it was, telling you exactly, it was in Ternopil, I think, yes, it was in Ternopil in 1217, vandalizing the Jewish grave by SS marks. But on the other hand, really much more maybe than any other country, they adopted the idea of the Holocaust as an issue, something that should be commemoratable, and they also had elected the president with Jewish roots, with ethnically Jewish president. And by the way, they have more ethnically Jewish officials that used to be, such as the prime minister in the past, Groisman, and nowadays Minister of Defense Reznikov. Okay, so Russia and Ukraine basically in the past were kind of friendly states. They were not enemies, but it started changing in 2014, sorry, it started to change when, after the Euromaidan events, when pro-Western government comes to power, and then basically the Russian narrative towards Ukraine starts to change, and they kind adopt this rhetoric of anti-Nazi rhetoric towards Ukraine and say basically Ukraine is influenced by the Nazis or by the neo-Nazis, and they start treat Ukraine in much more harsh and hostile way. So now we reach 24 of February 2022. And what do we have now? We have all these things written on the screen that you can see now, such as instrumentalization of anti-Semitism, a narrative presenting Ukraine as a Nazi state, and Russia's war against Ukraine as a direct parallel to the USSR's war against Nazi Germany. A narrative that presents Russians as the Jews of contemporary history, which you can see right there in this song clip. You can see people wearing the badge of Blue Star of David there. Basically, the song is not anti-Semitic. The idea of this song is that we're Russian now, the new Jews of our era, and all the world basically is against us, the Russians, like they used to be against the Jews in the past. But on the same time, they emphasize once again and once again the Jewish origins of President Zelensky and other senior officials of Ukraine. There is an idea of Žido Bandera. It's like in the past, and basically you can say that it's similar to the idea of Žido Komuna, which was used by the Nazis to claim against the Soviet Union. It was run by the Jews. So this is not exactly the same claim here, but the claim is that there are some Jews in Ukraine. Not all the Jews are bad, but there are some Jews in Ukraine that basically adopted this anti-Jewish or neo-Nazi idea. And well, we have Jewish neo-Nazis in Ukraine. There is also very critical approach, softly said, towards Israel's attitudes in this war, saying how you Israelis don't understand that we Russians fight against Nazism in Ukraine, and this is not okay that you are not aligned with us, but rather you kind of support Ukraine. we have this famous speech of Mr. Lavrov, Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, that he basically said, he had a kind of really problematic saying, while he was challenged by a journalist saying, well, how Zelensky can be neo-Nazi? He's a Jewish, basically. So the answer was, well, so what? Hitler also had Jewish blood. And this saying was highly criticized in Israel and in all the Western world. But the official Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia never actually withdrew from the saying. We don't have violent expressions against Jews in general, but in some particular examples, we can see such kind of things. For example, pretty in the beginning of the war, there is a guy called Venediktov. He used to be editor-in-chief of Radio Echo Moskwy, the Echo of Moscow, which used to be a liberal radio station operating from Moscow. It doesn't operate anymore. It was closed down in the beginning of the war. So he has this kind of appearance of head of pig near the entrance of his house. And it was a sticker, basically, of Ukraine's coat of arms. And it's written Judensau, which those of you who are familiar with history know that means Jewish pig. Well, these kind of things also appear, even though they are not common. Okay, in Belarus, basically we have more of the same, like in Russia. Once again, I'll not go too deep into the details because of lack of time, but you can see in the center of your screen really this kind of caricature that make this kind of comparison between Kristallnacht, 1938, and basically what they call negative attitude towards Russian worldwide. So you can see like Germans throwing a stone in a window of Russians in 2022. Basically say, well, Russians of today are like the Jews during the period of World War II and the Holocaust. So this is basically an instrumentalization of Holocaust to gain kind of support or maybe internal support and to justify all these ideas that we are fighting against the Nazis. And by the way, not only Ukrainians are Nazis, but all the world that supporting Ukraine is kind of also Nazi or neo-Nazi. In Ukraine, on the margins, we also have appearances of anti-Semitism, mainly on popular level, mainly different kind of vandalism that also appears. But in general, official propaganda of Ukraine are trying really to stick with the Jews and trying to emphasize how they are together with the Jews. You can see the chief rabbi there with the chief of staff of Ukrainian army, standing together with the menorah. But what they are doing, sometimes they are miscalculating what they are saying. And the really good example for this is the Zelensky's speech to the Knesset. When he tried to promote kind of narratives, says that what Russians are doing to Ukraine, basically it's similar to what the Nazis have done to Jews during the World War II and the Holocaust. He didn't say it directly in this claim, but it's kind of not far away from this claim, which is really also instrumentalization of the Holocaust, but to the other side. Okay, so what do we have? We have accusing of Ukrainian side of anti-Semitism by the Russians, directly or implied by the accusation of Nazism or neo-Nazism, to justify military and political aggression, combined with the delegitimization of the Ukrainian state. We have Russian propaganda effort, also Belarusian propaganda effort, that includes, basically have, including delegitimizing allusions, and not only allusions to the Jewish origin of the president of Ukraine and other officials in the Ukrainian government. We have an attempt to degenerate and arouse hostility to an emotive and ideological level against Israeli support for Ukraine, basically claiming that they really don't understand the course of history and acting in wrong side. Okay. and basically talking about the instrumentalization of the Holocaust. So, to sum up, to conclude, so there is, the war is not about anti-Semitism, it is not about Jewish issue, okay? But there is a usage of the Jewish issue, mainly in Russian and Belarusian propaganda, to gain support for their position and for their basic claim, their basic narrative that they are fighting against Nazis or neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Now I would like you to consider why it is possibly dangerous move. So one of the dangerous consequences of the war between Russia and Ukraine is intense propaganda that uses the Jewish question, anti-Semitic motives, appeals to anti-Semitic and xenophobic sentiments, accuses opponents of anti-Semitic ideology, and instrumentalizes terminology related to Jews, anti-Semitism, Nazi ideology, and the Holocaust for the purpose of delegitimizing the other side. Mainly on the Russian side towards the Ukrainian side, but in a way also it was otherwise. The Jewish question and anti-Semitism remain an issue that could potentially turn from theoretical latent danger, which is right now, into a potentially destructive danger. So in a state of war, when you have this kind of terminology, this kind of allusions, this kind of allegations, it can turn also to real hostility against the Jews. Thank you.
Okay, hi everybody. You're tired. It's been a long day, but it's been good so far. Okay, so the last panel, last but not least, is about refugees, forced migrants, and asylum seekers, temporary asylum seekers, the demographic and social consequences of the war. My name is Adriana Kemp. I'm the head of the School for Social and Policy Studies in the neighbor Faculty of Social Sciences. And before I introduce our speakers, we have 3 speakers, very promising. So just let me set the scene, which I guess that most of you know or are acquainted with. So February 24, 2022, the day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, marks also the reshaping of the global landscape of migration. According to data released by the UNHCR and also by the International Organization of Migration, over 8 million people have left Ukraine since the beginning of the war. In addition, over 5 million are internally displaced, largely those who have moved from the cities in the east of Ukraine. The forced displacement of Ukrainians bears some distinctive features, and I want just to mention them very briefly. The first one is that it has been massive in absolute numbers, but also in relative numbers. It comprises over 1/4 of the Ukrainian population of 44 million. Second, it has been rapid. It has been really swift. I mean, the vast majority of them have been displaced, have moved, have left in the first month, and then in the consecutive month. Very, very swift. Third, it is broadly dispersed. This is not so obvious. In a rather large number of countries, mostly of neighbor countries, such as Poland, that has received some 2 million, the Czech Republic, Romania, Moldova, that has the largest ratio of refugees, Ukrainian refugees, according to the country population. But also in Western Europe, the UK and Hungary, that accept, similar to Israel, very similar to Israel, Ukrainian of Hungarian ethnic origins. The fourth and last feature is their form of reception. As it is usually the case, also Ukrainian refugees have encountered different forms of reception in different destinations. Yet what has been salient is that differently from the experiences of refugees from Afghan and from Syria, and I think that Anastasia will talk about it, certainly their experience in the EU countries, the arrival of Ukrainian refugees has stirred, at least at the beginning, an impressive mobilization of solidarity networks, welcome initiatives, and proactive policies of incorporation that go beyond, some of which go beyond the humanitarian. This feature is a reminder of the tremendous significance that cultural, religious, ethnic, and social boundaries, as well as geopolitical interests, play in shaping how refugees are perceived, and if they are perceived as deserving recognition at all. As the conflict enters the second year, with no end in sight, what is the current situation? Very briefly, organizations working with refugees in several places report that much of the Ukrainian refugees find themselves in a limbo situation, which is not surprising, without much access to social services or employment, and a general lack of vision for the near future. For many, life in war zone is hard, but life as a refugee is harder, including the difficulty of finding work, operating in a second language, finding housing, schools, and setting up a whole new life. In a recent study by the International Organization of Migration, they estimate that 5.6 million of Ukrainians have returned to Ukraine. The biggest contingency is older, adult migrants, adult people who have struggled to integrate abroad, but also we find that a quarter of those returning are youngsters under the age of 18. A similar situation is taking place in Israel. Out of the close to 30,000, perhaps a little bit more, of Ukrainians who sought refuge in Israel, half have since either gone back or moved on to other countries. I want to remind you that over 4,000 of them, I think that 4,200 of the Ukrainians seeking asylum qualified for Israeli citizenship under the law of return, which entitles them to a whole set of rights, primarily to the right to have rights. For those that don't qualify for Aliyah, the restrictions on employment are one, if not the only, okay, but one of the main difficulties they encounter here. But as I said, it's not the only one. In addition to Ukrainian refugees fleeing from the war, Israel has become also the destination to another wave of migration forced out by Putin's regime. These are Russian citizens that opt for exile, voting with their feet against the authoritarian regime, that have created a new category, actually, within the larger community of Olim from the former Soviet Union, known here as Putin's immigrants. This is a new community whose social ID and place within Israeli society is yet to be explored and understood. And incidentally, actually, they arrive at very interesting times to Israel, okay, fleeing from authoritarian regimes to others, which puts them actually in what a colleague of mine, Julia Lerner, calls, a life in comparison, how they keep on comparing themselves between, authoritarianism from the homeland to the authoritarianism trends in the newfound. Okay, summing up, being forcibly displaced is one of the prices that comes with war for those that are forced to leave in order to survive. But being out of place, a stranger within society but not part of it, is the price refugees pay once they find asylum. And this session actually deals with the demographic, social, cultural, or identitarian consequences of the war. As it enters its second year, it brings their experiences and point of view of Ukrainian refugees and the new Russian emigration, as well as public attitudes and public sentiments towards them in a wide variety of contexts. So without further ado, let me introduce the speakers. So I will just present you, and then I will call you to come, please. So the first will be Dr. Maria Kaspina, that she will talk about Ukrainian Jewish refugees in Israel, Jewish identity in the context of the Russia-Ukrainian war. Dr. Maria Kaspina is a lecturer at the Center for Biblical and Jewish Studies, Russian State University for Humanities, and Deputy Academic Director of the Museum of Jewish History in Russia, in Moscow. She's also the coordinator of academic projects of SEFER, a Center for University Teaching of Jewish Civilizations. The second presenter will be Dr. Veronika Kostenko. that she will talk about transnational networks of the new Russian emigration. And Dr. Konstenko, she's an associate professor at the European University at St. Petersburg, being the chair of sociology department until last year, okay, for 2 years. That was a punishment or was good? In 2022, she left Russia and now resides in Israel as an independent scholar and work on a panel survey project on post-war emigration from Russia. And last but not least, our Professor Anastasia Gorodetsky, that she will talk about refugees, borders, and public attitudes toward asylum seekers. Professor Gorodetsky is the head of the International Master's Program in Migration Studies and faculty member in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Tel Aviv University. Her main research interests lie in the areas of global migration and immigrant integration, cross-national comparative sociology, and she is an expert on public attitudes towards immigrants and immigration and intergroup relations. So please, Maria. Due to time constraints, you will have 15 minutes. Yes, okay, each one of you, and we'll leave the discussion for the end.
Okay. So don't be surprised. We're going to perform as Berry Sisters today. So this is Maria Kaspina, and myself is Anna Kushkova. So we're going to present our project. And please forgive my voice. I hope it doesn't fail till the end of the presentation. I have the stupid virus or something. Okay, and thank you. Adriana, because you spared me some efforts, like in the introductory part of the presentation, because you already voiced some of the figures and some of the ideas. So our project is called Ukrainian Jewish Refugees in Israel, Jewish Identity in the Context of Russian-Ukrainian War. And it's on the first PowerPoint. It's an anthropological research, it's an oral history research, and as you see from the title of the presentation, we're focusing on Ukrainian Jews, their children, their grandchildren, and their spouses. In other words, both halakhic Jews and non-halakhic Jews, as well as non-Jews in case of spouses, but all those people who got Israeli citizenship according to the Chok HaShvut. So these people's individual stories of leaving Ukraine differ considerably. Some left in the first days or weeks of the war, some stayed there for months, some never experienced bombardments, air raids, others did, some stayed on the temporarily occupied territories occupied by the Russian forces. Many families were split, some lost their property, their relatives, others did not. Most of them went through the third country, usually Moldova, and eventually boarded Israeli planes to come here, and more or less all of them relied on the help of various Jewish organizations to do so. Okay, so in full humanitarian recognition and compassion to these people's tragedies, we as researchers in social sciences and humanities regard this as a unique anthropological situation which has to be captured now precisely for the deeper understanding of how people individually and as groups reflect upon and interpret the war situation as a whole, which resources they use to cope with multiple afflictions that came their way, and how they're reimagining their lives in the new country. In other words, this is what may be called the anthropology of emergency of some sort. I'll give you some stats about our project. There are 5 people working on it, 2 of whom have a thorough experience with anthropology of Jewish communities, and that's Dr. Kaspin and myself. Over, 2 decades or so, we went pretty much to every little shtetl in Ukraine where you could still find Jewish residents, and we spoke to them. We did our oral history field research there. We aim at recording 100 interviews at this point, and we're planning to make them accessible through the JDoc repository created by the Nadav Foundation, as well as through the National Library of Israel. So far, we recorded about 50% of interviews, but didn't really transcribe that many yet. We conduct our interviews in Russian, but we always give our interviewees a choice to speak whatever language they prefer. In my experience, and I recorded, 24 interviews, everybody opted for Russian. Most people said we're bilingual, we can easily speak in Ukrainian, but for the convenience reasons, we can do everything in Russian. Of course, there are many words and expressions in Ukrainian that are being inserted at various points of interviews, but in my experience, all interviews were in Russian. I think Masha has a slightly different experience, so you can ask her later on about that. Geography of interviews: eastern, northeastern Ukraine, Dnipro, Mariupol, Kharkiv, Izyum, Chernihiv, Kramatorsk, Zaporizhia. Central Ukraine: Kiev, Bucha, Irpin, Kremenchuk, Kropivnitsky. Southwestern Ukraine: Odessa, Mykolaiv, and others. And the geography, as you can imagine, is expanding all the time. So just to show you a couple of pictures that come from the interviews. How do I do that? Okay. So this is March 2022. This is a village near Kiev, something like 20 minutes away from Kiev itself, and people are taking this picture from behind their fence. And this is the top of the Russian tank that's moving along the street near their house. And they explained to me that there were rumors of inundating the village, that taking a picture like this might cost one life. But nevertheless, they took this picture. This is also this is also 2022, April, Kropivnitsky in Kirovohrad region. They're evacuating their 99-year-old grandmother. She's now here in Netanya. And this is a very interesting picture. It's the Hay Synagogue, Sinai Synagogue in Chisinau. And this is how Jewish organizations were helping Jewish refugees on their way to Israel, basically. It comes from the book that's called One-Way Suitcase, Чемодан в одну сторону, a wonderful, I think, title. By the way, I do have the book in the digital form, so if any of you are interested in having the book, just write to me, and I'll be happy to send it to you. Now, the principal distinctive feature of this research is that it's taking a broader anthropological perspective at the ongoing war-induced displacement. First and foremost, we're focusing on these people's Jewish identity and ways in which it was reshaped by the war and arrival to Israel. Among other things, we strive to uncover how their Jewishness impacts their vision of the whole context of the Russian-Ukrainian relations and Ukrainian politics, as well as their political allegiances and general humanitarian commitments. We ask whether these people's flight from Ukraine had a Jewish accent to it, so to speak. In other words, how Jewish ties and networks facilitated the very possibility of their relocation, as well as their settling in a new place. We also attempt, in as much as we can, to describe an anthropological profile of the Ukrainian part of the war-related Aliyah in light of their integration into the Israeli society. So we see this project on Ukrainian Jewish refugees in Israel, both as part of a broader research on Ukrainian refugees that's being undertaken in many countries. I know of Poland, research that's undertaken in Poland, in Germany, in France, in Canada, as far as I know, I'm sure in many other countries, but also as a distinct scholarly inquiry in which we apply the Jewish lens and simultaneously the anthropological lens to the ongoing Jewish immigration from Ukraine to Israel. And now I'm giving the floor to Masha for a while.
Well, thank you. I am an example of Putin's Aliyah. I made it a year ago, and we decided not to study ourselves, but to study someone different, and the closest different was the Ukrainian Jews, and we decided to make this project together with Anna and Nevlin Center. The broad anthropological perspective that we assume in this research reflects itself in our extensive questionnaire, which attempts to embrace issues such as our informants' pre-war Jewish identity, their attitude to Israel and immigration, their vision of the political developments in the independent Ukraine, their stance to the present-day Israeli political and social landscape. Our research group consisted of 5 people living in different parts of Israel, and we conducted a number of Zoom meetings before and prior to the beginning of the research. And in the course of this meeting, we discussed at length methods to be used, the structure of the questionnaire, the ways to conduct interviews, etc. And the most important feature of our questioning is that we try to contextualize the wartime experience of our interviewers within the following major areas of their experience: the Jewish tradition inside the family, in the society at large, the political situation in the former Soviet Union and in the independent Ukraine, and their new experience in the State of Israel. It should be emphasized that this broad and in-depth approach allows us to focus not only on the traumatic experience of our respondents, but also on their positive aspects of their identity, both Jewish and general civic identity. As of now, the questionnaire consists of 150 questions, but it begins being modified depending on the changing of political situation. There are 5 parts of the questionnaire. Sections. Yes, first is Jewish tradition. The question on the degree to which our informants keep Jewish religious and cultural tradition and their Jewish self-identification more broadly. In particular, we aim to find out how our informants' Jewish identity is inscribed into Ukrainian language and culture over the last 3 decades. The political contents question in this section aim to measure the degree to which our informants were participating in the social, cultural, and political life of the independent Ukraine, their view of various political developments that took place in the country since 1991, the assessment of Ukrainian political leaders, their views of Russian-Ukrainian relationship before war, their attitudes towards the end of Maidan, Crimea, Donetsk, and so on. The second part is concerned about Jewish immigration from USSR, Ukraine before the war with Russia, and here's the famous question: to go or not to go, pro and contra the immigration, why they did not do this, why they did this, and so on. And the basic part is Russian-Ukrainian war. This section contains questions on whether the war was expected, on the informant's immediate experience of it, on the evacuation, flight from Ukraine to Israel, on the changes to the attitude to the Russian and Ukrainian leadership, on the Russian propaganda, on the reasons and outcomes of the war and future relations between Russia and Ukraine. And the last part is life in Israel as a refugee repatriee. And finally, we'll look at ways in which our informants are integrated into Israeli life, as well as at how the Israeli experience is shaping their Jewish identity and national self-consciousness. Here are some examples of the anthropological questions we ask our informants. For example, can one say that Jews felt more or less vulnerable with the beginning of the war as compared to other groups of population? For example, less vulnerable precisely due to the possibility of immigration to Israel anytime, or more vulnerable with regard to the collective memory of anti-Semitism, persecutions, pogroms, and Holocaust. Second, can one say that Jewish networks became more active when the war broke out, both on a personal and on institutional level? For example, people started helping each other to survive, evacuate, immigrate, and so on. For example, does the fact that you are now living in Jewish state provoke any thoughts about your own Jewishness, about the Jewish life in the former USSR, Ukraine, about Zionism, and so on? And I'm going to conclude.
Okay, so we're trying to be very brief, but the last thing I want to emphasize again, so Masha, this question about whether you felt more or less vulnerable as Jews when the war started really shows that we're looking for subjectivities, for subjective perceptions of what was going on, what they were had to witness, and this is extremely important for us. And so to conclude, we just wanted to share one example of how we work with subjectivities, how we apply anthropological methods, and to show how anthropological intervention can enhance our understanding of the lived experience of our subjects, their individual and collective, again, subjectivities, as well as the human agency that they exerted at various multiple stages of decision making. So there's one question that we always ask our interviewees, which usually provokes a lot of interesting reflection and narratives on their part. And this, I think that's basically one of the key questions. And it sounds like this: how do you perceive yourselves right now? As refugees or as repatriates? And again, these are people who all have their Teudat Zeuts in their pockets. So they're like technically, formally, they're Israeli citizens. Nevertheless, apart from formal criteria, there are subjective perceptions of this whole situation of the war and relocation to Israel, immigration to Israel, and the formal and the subjective do not necessarily coincide. And here are some examples. So refugee or repatriate. So I'll just read a couple of those. One person says, it's hard for me to answer this question. I ran away from the war. Each day you live here, you get used to Israel more and more, and we all understand how much we owe to Israel. But you should also understand that our motherland is Ukraine, and our roots are there in Ukraine. We were uprooted from there like trees. For any tree that's being replanted, it needs a long time to get used to another place. One tree will take root, another will not. So I can't answer this question. So there's like indeterminate space for indeterminacy in self-perception. Another person says, I don't consider myself just a repatriate. Repatriates are those who packed 2 suitcases, 20 kilograms each, and went. Whereas I took just a small bag and I fled. I didn't go consciously, so I am a refugee. I was not preparing at all to go. And the last example, we can also see very like, stringent, like a cry of the soul. I feel like a refugee, a true homeless refugee, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying that all people feel like this, by far not. As I said, these are examples of disjuncts between the formal and the subjective perceptions, right? The reasons might be different for this disjunct. The forced nature of one's departure, which implies the lack of one's agency or control over the situation. Strong Ukrainian identity that these people had developed at home, definitely augmented by the plight of the country, by the ongoing military operations. Multiple vulnerabilities that these people feel in the Israeli society: social vulnerabilities, economic vulnerabilities, linguistic vulnerabilities, etc. And although the word refugee in Russian, as probably everybody knows, does sound a little bit denigrating, refugee, produces a discomfort, as people tell me, many people still opt to place themselves on this slot, even though they are, as I said already, full citizens of the state of Israel. In its own turn, this question, repatriate or refugee, is tied to another important one, namely whether people consider the current state in Israel temporary, or they are planning to return back to Ukraine whenever such opportunity avails itself. And here we're already in the area of politics, of policy making. Whether Jews who came to Israel from Ukraine as a result of the current war constitute a very specific type of aliyah distinct from the previous ones is certainly a question looming large behind this whole discussion. And again, we're arguing that qualitative anthropological research can contribute a lot to our understanding of this and other issues. So this is pretty much the first and the second presentation of this project. We're in the process of collecting interviews and thinking over. So we would really appreciate any questions, any suggestions, any thoughts, etc. Thank you.
Actually, this is a project that, sorry, do you hear me well? Okay, great, thank you. So basically, this is a project that we are working on with a group of my colleagues, also from the European University in St. Petersburg originally. Now we're all not in the European University and not in Russia anymore, and we are becoming the objects of our own study. One by one. Now everybody's out of Russia. Anyway, so since the beginning of the war, it became obvious that a lot of people in Russia are, they feel their lives are also ruined. Of course, I mean, by no means I'm comparing it to what had happened to Ukrainians. And this is an important point here. So, of course, this is a totally different story. But also, as Professor Tal Sadeh mentioned in his lecture, that the state requires not only territory, it requires a good story. And many Russians actually realize they don't have a good story to believe in anymore. And this story has fallen apart. It had shattered into pieces, and a lot of people of our generation and younger especially, and especially from the big cities, started to move on. And we realized it very quickly with a group of my colleagues in February, and decided to, that was basically the only thing we know how to do. We started to study this wave of immigration. At first it was a small project. It was a small survey. Now it grew into a huge project with 3 waves, panel, cross-sectional survey, 700 interviews, and so it's like big. But it used to be just a small initiative project just to save ourselves from, you know, like dumb scrolling the news all the time and just getting crazy. So now we use mixed method design. We complement our surveys with the interviews. So we basically know about these people whom we're interviewing already from the survey, and we use panel data, so it's important to trace the trajectories. So every wave we take some new people into the survey so that those who left after are also included, but we also trace those guys who left straight in February and March, so we know what had happened to them. So that's quite a big sample. More than 3,000 people in more than 100 countries. Some are, you know, like some locations do not allow us for real broad coverage. So 60 countries is something I can be sure about. So about 600 people in a panel. Oh, sorry, there is something in Russian here. Yeah, so there is quite high response and quite high adherence. So people stay in the survey, and many of them actually make it to the end. About 70% make it to the end and return. So, of course, the issue of sampling is accurate. I mean, we have practically no idea of the general population. It's, you know, like it's very shattered. We have some information from the FSB, which controls the borders of Russia. It's totally useless because, I mean, and of course they don't want to provide it, but even if they provide it, it's totally useless because every, you know, like every crossing of the border is counted as if it's an immigration, which is not true. Then we have sometimes, we're getting some information from different countries, how many people they have actually received. It helps to at least build some picture of how it works. And we adjust a little bit if we receive this information and this is valid. But of course, in general sense, we do not have a proper information about our general population. But we are trying to do our best. We do online panel with quality control. We try to make as much as possible for diverging the sample. We offer survey in hundreds of Telegram channels for immigrants. We have actually found all the possible, many of the possible Telegram channels of the immigrants in more than 100 countries using various parsing techniques of the Telegram. So we parse not only political but also non-political Telegram channels, especially for the reason of, you know, like the best Telegram channel for us is the Telegram channel for the young mothers who are, you know, like discussing stuff in the small town channel and, you know, like sharing things for the babies and stuff like that. That's our ideal case, you know, because they're not politicized and they are discussing things we need, like we want to get. So we want to cover as many communities as possible to, you know, slightly randomize the sample. So we're very crazy about ethics and safety. During between the first and the second wave, so the first wave was on March, the second was in August. Between these two waves, we have continued to sample those who returned to Russia. Like after the mobilization, we decided not to sample those who returned to Russia. That was an ethics issue, the safety issue pretty much, because we think that it could be of danger for people if they're in Russia and they, participate in international, we understand it's a little bit of an exaggerated safety concern, but things are changing so rapidly that, people can be put in prison for lesser things. We know that. So now we use maximum anonymity. We keep the data apart from the keys. So there is only one data server where, the whole bunch of things. So we have an ethical approval in IRB for the survey and for the interviews. So, and of course, we know it's a traumatic experience because many Russians also had left quite quickly, and that's a traumatic experience, and we try to do our best to avoid re-traumatizing the respondents. So basically, just a few facts. I'll try to keep it short because people are very tired, I see that. So basically, these people who had immigrated are richer, much richer, say 27% as opposed to 4% in general population of Russia can buy a car. They're less often married, they're higher educated, they have less children, they're younger, their median age is 32 years old. A lot of them, a regional wave, the first wave, the one which is called the relicants, were very commonly the IT workers, so the programmers and the web developers and stuff. In fact, it changed. It keeps changing. The less and less people of these professions are in the sample. But this is this is why these people are still calling themselves the relicants, because they want to. They don't want to call themselves refugees because this title is actually a label for Ukrainian refugees, and then they understand that it brings some. It brings some privilege in a way because people help refugees, and many of these Russians they understand they cannot accept this help because they are not in such a bad situation. And of course, they don't want to call themselves migrants because they used to this pigeonholing of people who came from Central Asia and Caucasus, and migrants meant a very particular type of a low-qualified job. And it's quite racist, in Russia, the migrant notion. So they try to be in between, and they try to call themselves relicants, which is, it doesn't work like this anymore. Like in that first wave, it really worked like that. Now it's not true. Nobody's relocating anyone from Russia anymore. These were, the first days when the international IT companies were bringing, the planes out of Russia. And there was a day in Yerevan, in the airport of Zvartnots in Yerevan, when there were 47 planes in one day, which brought IT people from Russia to abroad. That was a real relocation. Now it's not, but they try to keep with this label. So countries of destination, that's March. Mostly people went to Turkey, Georgia, Armenia. Israel is quite small in comparison to many other countries, Uzbekistan, Serbia, Kazakhstan. The mobilization wave was more of Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Kyrgyzstan, which is why? Do you know why? These are 3 countries which allow Russians without foreign passports. So it's pretty technical. Nothing to do with culture, with anything like that. Purely technical. A lot of people just ran away with just nothing with them during mobilization. And many of these countries allow Russians without visas, but with their foreign passports. So what's important about translocal networks? What do we see? We see that people keep their relations. They keep their relations very active. And what we hear in all of our interviews is that the most important thing people have left are their connections to people. To those new people they met in the countries they resided. The people who left in Russia, sure, thank you, and the network which is all around the world. We call this network rhizome, like in Deleuzean style, pretty much, because it's very alive. People are, they're all the time trying to, connect each other, and this network is moving all the time, and people are sending each other messages like, how do you feel, how are you? And it's like very, it's not stable. It's still, moving very much. And what's important, people, at first, there was a huge clinch between those Russians who left and those who stayed. And there was a very traumatizing experience when those who left were trying to, pull their relatives and friends out of Russia, saying it's impossible to live there. You just go, go, because the borders are closing. And those who stayed, they were like, no way, how can we go? It's like our life, our country, why we should go out because of these bastards. And that was a very big collision. And now we see that by August, people are they are set with the positions they have. They still value their relations, but they do not seem to try to persuade people who have a different position on the issue of immigration to change their decision. So they say it's more important to stay in good relations than to make, your mom come or something like that. It is a great change because in March it was different. So some people returned. Some people returned from March to August. About 16% returned. Most people who returned were the people who were the most wealthy. They had things to finish. So they just came back to sell their apartment, to sell their car, to, have the things done. It's not that, there was a little percentage of people who said, I cannot do that, I cannot find a good job, I cannot find a proper place to live, I cannot do this language, stuff like that. But predominantly, these were just rich people who came back and they planned to return abroad. Many Russians fear discrimination. Not many faced it. A lot of people felt like that they will be hated when they come abroad. It didn't happen. So sometimes there are some conflicts. It's very rare. What they actually see, they see institutional discrimination from the banks, from visa issuing organizations, and it's especially traumatizing when people come somewhere like Turkey, they settle themselves, they buy furniture, and then they're being told that now they have to leave again. And the same happened in Kazakhstan when the people also had to leave again, and the so-called visa run was canceled, this visa run policy. The same happened for Cyprus when people were denied of their bank accounts, and the bank accounts were shut down. So stuff like that really feels like people feel really discriminated. The last slide, okay? So economic and psychological well-being of immigrants always falls down. 1 or 2 stages. So those who could have bought a car now can only, barely buy clothes. So this immigration is not driven by financial reasons, not at all. This is purely moral or political. 80% of those who immigrated by now from Russia were politically active. They were active in NGOs, they were active in politics, they were signing petitions, they were going out on the streets for demonstrations. So this is a very politically active class. So those who could have worked remotely, at least for some time, are much better off. It's much more, stable situation. Psychologically, Russians abroad are very depressed, especially women. There is a huge gender aspect here. They feel a lot of guilt. They feel a lot of pain. They feel pain for Ukrainians. They feel pain for their own country. And but it's getting slightly better. So when the time passes, after half a year, it's getting slightly better. Some immigrants are very vulnerable. It seems that they're all very rich and well off. No, it's not true. The most vulnerable groups, those who were discriminated against and prosecuted, are the most vulnerable abroad, especially the queers and the LGBT. They are in the worst situation. So what supports them, of course, helping others, NGOs a lot help Ukrainians and Ukrainian refugees. Potential integration is something that supports them, social ties with relatives, and hope for the end of the war. And this is just how I can maybe leave it here so that we, just a small point. They're not united. Russians abroad are not united because they don't believe in the old in the old men of Russian diaspora who are telling stuff about the good Russians and all this rubbish. So this new immigration is very much horizontally structured, very grassroots. They find it important that the leaders actually speak in terms of gender optics, in terms of post-colonial optics. No people from the old diaspora can speak about that. And there is a big clinch between the old and the new Russian diasporas. Yeah, this is pretty much it. Thank you very much.
Refugees, borders, and public attitudes toward asylum seekers.
Hello, I will try to be also fast and brief in light of the hour. I would like to take us a little bit to the past, and most of my talk actually will talk about refugees in the first 2 decades, if you can, in the first 2 decades of 21st century, based on my own research, and then I will try to do maybe some comparison to the situation in terms of the public attitudes toward refugees from Ukraine. So, one thing I want to put here from the beginning is that the so-called European refugee crisis in 2015, when people were talking about it, it was not an unprecedented. It's not something, it's in terms of the number, it's not unprecedented number. We already, Europe also seen these numbers, and if we look to the official statistics, we can say in 2015, 21 million refugees were in the world, but in 92, the figure was slightly lower, and in general, the global population was just 3/4 of the population in 2015. So it's really important to me to say when we talk about attitudes toward refugees, the question how we perceive the number of the refugees and how this perception of the numbers at the end influence public attitudes toward refugees in general. So just we can look at it in different way. We could compare the number of the refugees that enter Europe in 2015 and the total population European Union, or we can look into the number of the only Syrian refugees in Turkey population, and to see from where we've heard much more about so-called refugee crisis in 2015. So one of the questions that I tried to ask at some point, what happened with the public attitudes toward refugees in Europe during these 2 decades, or first 2 decades of 21st century. And trying to see whether there was any temporal change in exclusionary attitudes toward asylum seekers, and I could see the data from 2002, 2014, and 2016. And if we looked at this number, so the high number mean high level of exclusionary attitudes toward asylum seekers, low level of exclusionary attitudes toward asylum seekers. And one of the things that you could see here, that from 2002 to 2014, exclusionary attitudes became lower. The people became more tolerant. But then from 2014 to 2016, we see again the rise in exclusionary attitudes toward asylum seekers across almost all European countries, at least these countries that I have here on the table. And you would say, okay, if you go with the classical theory of competitive threat theory, we know that where there is a rise in the size of outgroup population, we could see a rise in exclusionary attitudes toward this population. But on the other hand, we also know that there were not rise in every European country in 2015 in the number of asylum seekers. We know that the asylum seekers from Syria and Afghanistan and that wave arrived to certain countries. They didn't arrive to all European countries. And still, when we see, if we see, wow, this is a different colors. If we see the numbers from 2002 to 2014 and then 2016, the higher the number, the higher the level of exclusionary attitudes, we could see that almost all countries behave the same. Yeah, it's almost the general triangle, a part of several exclusion, and this exclusion was Great Britain and Ireland. So the question I try to ask, what can explain the rise if it's not, let's say, number of asylum seekers in these countries? So what I did, maybe because it's really, did it help? Not? Worse? This one? This is okay or it's not okay? This one, it's okay? Okay. It looks absolutely different in my screen, so I'm sorry. I don't like the colors are. Okay, so I worked with the European Social Survey with the 3 waves, 70s country. I did some hierarchical age cohort panel model. Never matter. Some fancy methodology. At the end, this would be the result. So at the end, we can say that support for exclusionary government policy toward asylum seekers, they tend to be less pronounced in places enjoying prosperous and economic conditions. No news. This is we know. This support for exclusionary government policy toward asylum seekers is likely to rise in concert with the increased inflow of asylum seekers and to decline with the decreased inflow of asylum seekers. Also not news. But what I did found, and I think more interesting in this study, is that support for this exclusionary government policy toward asylum seekers was also high in countries that share border with the country that experience high asylum seekers inflow. Countries that didn't experience very high asylum seekers inflow by itself, but just share the border with the country that experience high asylum seekers inflow. More than that, support for exclusionary policy toward asylum seekers were especially high in countries that bordered more than one country that experienced high inflow of asylum seekers, but didn't experience high inflow of asylum seekers by itself. So the level, in relative terms, for example, the level of exclusionary attitudes toward asylum seekers in country that did experience high inflow and that country that didn't experience high inflow of asylum seekers but shared the border were the same as compared to the country that didn't experience high inflow of asylum seekers and didn't share the border with any country that experienced such an inflow. So you can think about, let's say, Germany and France. Yeah, there's a high inflow. France, no, but still there was a high level of exclusionary attitudes. Or if you talk about Eastern European countries, you can think about Hungary and Czechia, Hungary and Czechia, and we will see absolutely different numbers of asylum seekers that arrived in this country in 2015, but relative to countries that didn't experience any inflow of asylum seekers, as has no border with other countries that experience inflow of asylum seekers, their exclusionary attitudes would be almost the same. So the reaction is, it's European Union, it's Schengen zone, it's media, people know what's going on in other countries. So the situation when you have, when your country didn't experience asylum seekers but share the border, it's kind of potential threat. It's a potential inflow. Yeah, they may come. In addition, when we know that the presence of outgroup population, make work through the competitive threat mechanism and influence our attitudes toward this group. But it also make work the presence of outgroup population through the mechanism of intergroup contact. Yeah, the presence of some group may create at least potentiality for contact. And intergroup contact usually reduce exclusionary attitudes and hostilities. In the situation when country didn't experience high inflow of asylum seekers, but border other country where there is a high inflow of asylum seekers, the only mechanism that could work is a threat. It's a threat perception. They may come, and I do not know them because I have no opportunity to be in contact with them. And this is how would I, at least in this study, try to explain this high level of or rise in exclusionary attitudes toward asylum seekers in European countries, although in those that asylum seekers almost didn't arrive. Yeah, the situation is different in Great Britain and Ireland. They are far away there in Portugal, so we couldn't see there this kind of rise. And I do want, in the time that I have, I do not need this already, to talk a little bit about the comparison of attitudes between attitudes toward Ukrainian refugees and refugees from Syrian refugees. And I use here work of Lenka Dražanova and Andrew Gidas that collected this data in June of 2022. And in terms of the numbers, yeah, you remember in 2015, yeah, it was 1,300,000 people who entered Europe, and it was the crisis, yeah, it was the flooding, there were so many, yeah, we do not know what to do with this, and it was not unprecedented then, but now if we talk about 2022, 2023, with 5 million Ukrainian refugees who were already registered and get the protection. So I think we need also to think about the numbers. And then let's see now in terms of the attitudes. The first graph asks people in 8 countries, whether do you think that our government should allow Ukrainian refugees to enter and live here? Yeah, and then the answer could be allow none, allow few, allow some, and allow many. This yellow, I don't know what kind of color it became. And you could see that in most of the countries, the attitudes are very welcoming. Yeah, it's nothing new about here. But then you could see this question when we talk about Syrian refugees. And they maybe try to compare the first allow none, yeah, the strictest exclusionary attitudes, where people say, no Syrian refugees should come to our country. And you could see that in Czechia it would be still a third, and in Slovakia almost more than third. But when we will see these attitudes toward Ukrainian refugees, the number would be absolutely different. Yeah, the level of exclusionary attitudes toward Syrian refugees much higher than toward Ukrainian refugees. And then we try to ask the question, why? And some answers may be really kind of obvious. Definitely part of it's all the racism. We can talk about the perceived cultural threat when research on public attitudes toward the minority and toward the immigrant groups talk about the close, yeah, when we see the closer the group in terms of the culture, the more welcoming attitudes are. If the group perceived as more distant, attitudes become more hostile. But there is some other also issue. One of them is age and gender composition of these two groups of attitudes, at least how it perceived. Most of the Ukrainian refugees were women and kids, yeah, and most of the refugees from Syria, for example, and Afghanistan were young men, and the level of crime among young men in any country usually highest, yeah, in any population. So, but then I think there is another two important issues that we should take into account. It's previous intergroup contact, meaningful contact between Ukrainians and, for example, people in Czechia, Slovakia, and Moldova. Yeah, so Poland, there is some relationship. And another issue is that if you go with the social psychology and the way how stereotypes and hostility and exclusionary attitudes are developed, the first stage would be always group identification. Yeah, we need to, as a local population, to identify us, and we need to identify our group as them. I think that in the first months of the war, the ultimate them were Russians, and Ukraine were not perceived as them. They were still perceived as us. Once they perceived as us, there is no way, yeah, to develop a real hostile and negative attitudes, yeah, in a moral, yeah, normative term, good way of the meal. So this lack of the us and them in that time also, I believe, helped at least to some Zman to hold any negative attitudes and competition over the resources. Okay, I will finish here. Thank you. And sorry for the colors.